Hello and welcome to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. Last time we had a very lengthy look at the Amorphous Androgynous album, the Isness. And this week we'll be having a look at the relatively small promotional campaign that followed. The Future Sound of London Radio Mix XFM, 22nd of September 2002, Radio Magnetic 2nd of October 2002, and Radio Nova 10th of October 2002. The promotional campaign for the Isness was, on the whole, a lot shorter than that for the band's 90s albums. Having abandoned the ISDN format, with it being useful for the F.S.O.L Ultra Media Broadcast System project but less appropriate to Amorphous Androgynous, and with the live on-stage performances still a few years away, the album itself existed in a hinterland. One show was created for promotion, however, and has become loosely known as the Isness Mix to fans. A 30-minute show of studio tracks, broadcast on XFM in September, and later to Glasgow station Radio Magnetic and Radio Nova in Paris in October, the transmission falls somewhere between DJ Mix and ISDN transmission. All tracks are Amorphous studio pieces. In some senses, the show feels more like a Mello Hippo disco show promotional mix rather than one for the Isness, coming a few weeks before that single, and previewing it with the first 3 tracks. At the time, the single was yet to be announced, so fans only really heard an exclusive 15-minute version of the track. We now know it consists of an instrumental version of Yo-Yo, and then She Sells Electric Ego and Slow-Mo, plus a brief interlude in the form of the opening minute of Trying to Make Impermanent Things Permanent. Hearing it at the time was exciting, especially due to the far more electronic sound on the mixes. The second half of the show consists of Isness tracks, Guru Song, High Tide on the Sea of Flesh, Goodbye Sky Reprise and Her Tongue is Like a Jellyfish, as well as a brief snippet of the unreleased track Wendover Woods. High Tide begins with an exclusive remix section acting as an environment between it and Guru Song, which is quite a beautiful 20 seconds. Wendover Woods is a slow piece with a lumbering beat, groovy bass, guitar loops and skronking saxophone. Most of the tracks are simply cross-faded and there are no spoken samples anywhere in the mix. Due to the poor quality of the bootleg, recorded from what sounds like a 96 kilobits a second stream from the Radio Magnetic website, and the relative lack of exclusive material, the show is of little interest other than to collectors. It's never been released officially on the Podroom. As with all other radio shows from the time, it was announced as an F.S.O.L mix despite all the material being by Amorphous Androgynous. The bootleg cover I designed is almost certainly the best of all the ones I made at the time. Amorphous Androgynous, the Mello Hippo Disco Show. Release date, 2nd of December 2002-ish. During interviews promoting the Isness, Gaz began to mention the next release would be an album of psychedelia mixed in a bizarre way. For a while, fans could only speculate what this would be. One suggestion was it would finally be a release of a Monstrous psychedelic bubble mix, another that it would be a collection of cosmic jukebox remixes. Eventually, Gaz described it as sampling bits from this record and putting them back together in different forms. If you sample material, you tend to loop it more, which lends it a trance-like quality, something which would perfectly describe the Mello Hippo Disco Show's single release. Effectively a multi-part single lasting 33 minutes over 8 tracks, it finds them incorporating more electronics into their music again. 3 of the tracks have been premiered on that previous Isness mix on the radio, with the final track, Life's a Flow, being the Abbey Road or mispress version of the piece, and 1997's early version, Trying to Make Impermanent Things Permanent, also present, plus 3 previously unheard versions. By this point, an 8-track, 33-minute single wouldn't be allowed anywhere near the charts, and the record is generally referred to as an EP. It starts with 2 tracks bookended with silence, as had become the norm by this point. The rest of the EP, however, plays gaplessly, with environments even linking some of the tracks. This move towards a more typical F.S.O.L approach was generally popular with fans, along with the heavy use of synths, although as the original track was one of the least popular Isness tracks for those less keen on the new direction, the release was still a mixed blessing. Jackknife Lee's glitchy breaks mix adds a more overtly electronic sound. In terms of how well it works as a release in its own right, it definitely feels a touch weaker than the 90s singles, if only because every track here is very much a direct remix of the original, rather than a loose variation on a theme. Ultimately, can a 4-chord sequence be fully sustained for over half an hour? In the end, it just about works, partially for me because I love the original so much, but there are some whose patience has been tried with the release. As with the previous year's Papua New Guinea translations, each track has its own name rather than simply being labelled parts 1 to 8. Most of them are named after lyrics from the song. Alongside the 8-track CD edition, a 3-track 12-inch was also released, as well as a promo CDR featuring 3 exclusive edits, straightforward radio edits of Yo-Yo and the Jackknife Lee mix, as well as a newly constructed radio edit blending bits of various versions, as well as exclusive sections. None of these edits have ever been released commercially, although James Hyman played some of them on his XFM show. The release was very muddled, originally planned for release on the 11th of November, only to be put back to 2nd of December at the last minute. Copies began to turn up in London record stores in mid-November, however, and ultimately they trickled out to fans over a period of weeks. The release was promoted on the official website with a mini-site including clips of all 8 tracks. The cover art is very much in line with that of the isness, with the same style pinhole photography, layout and font. The booklet inner features edited versions of the cover, as well as black and white photography of the band and a roulette wheel photograph. After the debacle with the isness, Hypnotic were not offered a version to release in the US. Only the 12-inch features the Future Sound of London present on the sticker, with the CD free of the name. Yo-Yo. Opening the Mello Hippo single, Yo-Yo is effectively an alternate take on the original track. Much higher mellotron notes, looser drums, growling synth bass and filtered guitar and voices in the background make the track feel more laid back. The middle section features a guitar solo. The chorus lyrics are reversed. Mello Hippo Disco Show is sung 3 times with Mumbo Jumbo Slow Fellatio only once. The track works brilliantly as an opener to the single, a significantly different take to the album mix, yet believable as an alternate original version, much like My Kingdom Part 1 and Cascade Part 1 differed from their album counterparts. Yo-Yo itself wasn't a working title for the Mello Hippo Disco Show. She Sells Electric Ego. The longest track on the Mello Hippo Disco Show by far, She Sells Electric Ego opens with lush synth chords and electric bass, quickly joined by gently rolling beats and chopped up female vocals. The first half of the track feels very much like a remix rather than an alternative take, brass and string stabs fed through dubby delays, a harp loop drawing focus for a few bars, the higher mellotron loop from Yo-Yo briefly appearing, a guitar solo chopped and mangled over chunky beats. Just before the 3-minute mark, vocals appear again, and as the track builds up, layers of synth noises, heavily filtered strings and other sounds are layered on top. The best description I can give of the track is, if the original was by a totally different artist, this is probably what a Future Sound of London remix would sound like. Dozens of sounds from the original are chopped and resampled, triggered and layered throughout the track in classic F.S.O.L style, giving the piece a dense, textured feel. Oddly filtered and looped sitars and tremoloed synths join a marching beat into a hypnotic, droning outro section. This might well be the bit Gaz was referring to when discussing sampling and looping leading to a material with a trance-like quality. Personally, I don't think the single needs several vocal tracks next to each other at the start, but otherwise She Sells Electric Ego is faultless. The Mello Hippo Disco Show Jackknife Lee mix. Garrett Jackknife Lee had a studio in the same complex as the Glaxial Pharmaceutical, where he was working on his own music. Gaz told Whispering and Hollering, "Got drawn to the sounds coming out of his door basically, and gradually I got into the idea of working with him. He loves what he's doing and he's electronic oriented, an amazing producer, just vibe off him. Electronic oriented is definitely the phrase for this heavily glitchy breakbeat mix, something that fit perfectly into the IDM sound of the early noughties. It gets quite intense in the second half with mangled beats building up behind Gaz's vocals, plus backing vocals, flutes and mellotrons from the original. It's interesting that Gaz was so into Lee's very electronic music, especially at the point where he'd stopped even referencing F.S.O.L in interviews and the DJ mixes began to eschew contemporary material entirely. Lee himself created the remix on a laptop while in holiday in Canada, a production style incredibly at odds with the Amorphous analog approach. Slow-mo. Cross-fading in from the Jackknife Lee mix, Slow-mo continues the more electronic sound with big synth sweeps, yet another new beat, they clearly enjoyed programming breaks at this point, and a theremin-like synth solo. This instrumental version plays around with the structure, going into a breakdown for a wailing flute and chopped up guitars, throwing in new percussion at various points, and eventually returning to the opening synth theme again. The main track cuts out at the 3-minute mark, leaving a 2-minute environment, the band's first proper one since March 1997. to see out the rest of the track with a child's voice reading otherwise unused lyrics from the song, bird song, some bizarre animal noises, and samples of traditional overtone singing. Eventually, orchestra sounds come in, building up to the next track. Having a properly long environment here is an absolute treat after a few releases without any links between pieces at all, and it reinforces the idea that the Mello Hippo single feels a little more F.S.O.L-ish than the isness. Hippodrone. The only track on the Mello Hippo single not to take its name from one of the song's lyrics is a punchy instrumental that lurches into life from the first second, with deep warm bass, sitar melodies followed by string chords and electric bass lead, and then pizzicato strings, vocals, Mikey Rowe's wonderful organ solo, harp and eventually electric guitar. Effectively, it's an instrumental jam, jazz style, with each instrument given a moment to provide a solo before moving on to the next. Running to less than 3 minutes, it's a fun piece that sets out its stall, gets on with it and finishes before it gets tired. Excellent stuff, and possibly my favourite track on the single, albeit one that only really works in context. It might feel a little slight when listened to on its own. Field recordings and filtered vocals form a brief environment leading into the next track. Trying to make impermanent things permanent. The Great Lost track. Quite why more of this wasn't included on the single is beyond me. One of the first tracks created for the isness, Trying to Make Impermanent Things Permanent, was first heard on the 1997 John Peel session, made it through to the mid-97 broadcasts to be included on the first ever Monstrous Psychedelic bubble mix too. Over the years it was dramatically reworked and combined with Gaz's song Yo-Yo to become the Mello Hippo disco show. That said, when it was announced to be part of the single, many people were happy it was getting a proper release. An 8-minute beast of a track starting with an organ loop, staggered drums, sax lines and Gaz singing the title. The piece eventually gets up to full steam with a stone-sounding breakbeat, synth sweeps, mellotron line and electric guitar samples, the latter three becoming big parts of Mello Hippo years later. The track eventually changes into a drum and bass section featuring Mikey Rowe's excellent organ solo. Sadly, this whole section is missing from the bizarre 3-minute edit on the Mello Hippo single. Given the odd intro section, this short version barely gives any opportunity to get an idea of how the track feels before the strings come in and it's on to the next piece. A huge shame. Thankfully, the full studio version got a proper release via the Podroom edition of the aforementioned Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble Mix, where all 8 minutes can be heard in their glory halfway through part 2. The World's in Transience. A brief orchestral break between all the electronic psychedelic madness on the Mello Hippo single, The World's in Transience finds the band taking the string and brass parts of the track and soloing them, along with a few vocal lines, to act as a kind of classical interlude in true prog fashion. The vocals and occasional electronic sounds remind you of who's involved here, but otherwise it's mostly an acoustic piece. There's some particularly nice umpire tuba in there, as well as a train going by, samples of rooks and some unsettling laughter, continuing the F.S.O.L sample vibe. The Mello Hippo Disco Show Jackknife Lee Remix Radio Edit. There's an argument to be made that cutting a 4-minute 24 track down to 3 minutes 48 for a radio edit is somewhat unnecessary. This edit basically removes 2 minutes 41 to 3:07 and the final 15 seconds of the outro, otherwise everything is the same as the full-length Jackknife Lee mix. Yo-Yo Radio Edit. With Yo-Yo effectively being the A-side to the CD single of the Mello Hippo Disco Show, it makes sense as a choice for a radio edit. It's not the most subtle edit, simply cutting the track at 2 minutes 46 and bolting on the chorus and outro. One of those tracks that's little more than a curio really when it comes to listening as a fan. The Mello Hippo Disco Show Radio Edit. Trust Gaz and Bride to make an exclusive version of a track and then hide it away on a radio promo CDR, containing elements of the Abbey Road version, the final album mix and Hippodrone, but all in all very much its own version. The radio edit is a bizarre track, featuring a guitar solo behind Gaz's vocals, a fuzzy bass riff, a clean guitar loop in the middle that isn't heard on any other version of the track, and no trace of the Trying to Make Impermanent Things 1997 vocals. It's a strange little mix that's even played at a higher pitch than the other versions, and it's worth tracking down on YouTube if you can. All in all, the Mello Hippo single aligned with Gaz's interviews at the time, suggesting that he was getting back into electronica again, and there was much joy when shortly after the release it was announced that a new F.S.O.L album was in the works. (2002) remixes. 2002 looks very similar to 2001 in terms of remixes, two alternate takes of a track, both Cosmic Jukebox remixes. After these, the Cosmic Jukebox project died a death, and no more remixes would be produced until the end of the decade. Deadly Avenger, Day 1, F.S.O.L Cosmic Jukebox Mix. The Deadly Avenger mixes are weird. They don't sound anything like the band's other isness era material, and are the only tracks from the period that the F.S.O.L name truly fits. It's quite funky with wah-wah guitar samples and a groovy bass line, but ultimately very electronic, with breakbeats, synth chords, arpeggios and solos, drum machines and typically F.S.O.L odd little samples. It's also the first F.S.O.L remix to sound a lot like the original, sampling the synth chords and guitars and keeping the same laid-back electronic funk vibe, albeit without the house elements. It closes with seashore field recordings heard on other F.S.O.L tracks, which are the only real hints at who's behind this very uncharacteristic track. At the time I was baffled and disappointed by the remix, wanting more Amorphous style psychedelia. These days I listen to it and enjoy the subtly melancholic vibe mixed with funky upbeat rhythms. Nevertheless, it remains an outlier and one of the most unusual tracks in the band's extensive catalogue. It's also one that very rarely gets talked about or even referenced within the band's fanbase. The remix was released on the 12-inch single of We Took Pelham. Fun fact, I come from the same small town in the Midlands as Deadly Avenger. Deadly Avenger Day 1 F.S.O.L Cosmic Jukebox Mix version 2. Unlike the smoother, more melancholic Cosmic Jukebox mix, version 2 is a tougher sounding piece, sampling the original's bouncy bass line and relegating the synth chords to the outro. The drums are incredibly punchy, a heavy breakbeat that cuts in and out with different percussive elements throughout the track. The distorted synth lead from the first version is given a much more prominent place in the mix, sounding more playful without the jazzy chords in the background. Around the halfway point, these chords begin to find their way in and the mood mellows out a little. The final 30 seconds heads into much weirder territory, an environment with field recordings, digital synth noise and echoing voices, reminding us that this is indeed an F.S.O.L track. As with the first mix, it sounds neither like any era of F.S.O.L nor Amorphous Androgynous, and exists in its own little pocket musical world. This mix was released on the CD version of We Took Pelham. A Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble Exploding in Your Mind, Volume 3, XFM, 27th of December 2002. Having attempted an Amorphous-focused radio mix earlier in the year, Brian and Gaz returned to the DJ mix format for the third volume of the Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble Exploding in Your Mind series, broadcast on long-term supporter James Hyman's XFM show The Rinse at the end of 2002. Not referred to as a Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble mix on the night, Brian later sent me the rather literal-looking cover. After a run of increasingly samey mixes at the end of 2001, this show, broadcast almost exactly 1 year after their previous mix, consists almost entirely of material not spun on one of the group's earlier mixes. Several of the tracks are overlaid with the band's own effects and samples. For example, Zappa's Apostrophe features laughter and synth sweeps from the Mello Hippo disco show, and many of these were listed in the band-supplied tracklist as F.S.O.L remixes. The style of music on display feels very different to the 2001 mixes, with far less emphasis on whimsical easy listening, novelty cover versions, 60s psychedelic pop and film scores. Instead, a significant amount of the mix is taken up by the more groove-oriented music of the early 70s, with an emphasis on funk, jazz fusion and hard rock, with occasional forays into folkier sounds. Only 5 tracks on the whole mix come from later than 1979, and none of them especially electronic sounding, apart from the very brief appearance of LFO's LFO and Shizuo's Sweat for about half a second each. At this point, the mix being attributed to F.S.O.L feels even more tenuous than ever, despite the occasional future sound of London stings used throughout. Tracks are linked by brief effects and snippets of other songs, but there's very little in the way of proper environments here. Indeed, many tracks are in and out within a minute or so, making a very dense selection with little room to breathe. Numerous tracks given in the tracklist are either wrong or impossible to find any record of online in typical F.S.O.L fashion. 2 of the band's friends appear in the mix. Dan Pemberton's string piece Catastrophe appears for the first time before being absorbed into the 2010 F.S.O.L track End of the World. The Foot is the first appearance of Park, the mystery character in the isness' 3-man band photos. His long overdue F.S.O.L digital release looks like it might never happen at this rate. Despite my almost overbearing enthusiasm for the 2 Amorphous Androgynous releases of 2002, this was the point where I stopped paying such close attention to the Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble mixes. The previous year's shows, although repetitive when played in short succession, had the benefit of gradually familiarising listeners with particular tracks. This 60-minute block of tracks, only 3 or 4 of which I'd heard before, mostly on the end of the Monstrous psychedelic bubble material I was less fond of, was just too intimidating to really get into. I made a bootleg cover, and interestingly, despite the F.S.O.L idents throughout the mix, I decided to label this one as Amorphous Androgynous, burned a CD, but probably only listened to it 2 or 3 more times. Re-listening today, I've taken to the mix more, possibly due to my appreciation of this kind of music more now than, scarily, half my life ago. As with the other Bubble radio shows, I feel it's overdue a more regular listen from me. The show was released in the Podroom in November 2008 before being removed alongside most of the mixes a short while later. It was eventually added to the Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble Mixcloud page in 2018, retconned as an Amorphous Androgynous mix. And that's it for this week and for 2002. Do drop me a comment below, I'd love to read your comments. Do you remember this period? Do you have any feelings on the music discussed? Was the Mello Hippo Disco Show single a little bit more up your street than the isness perhaps? I do really love reading your comments. There are also like, subscribe, share buttons down there. As ever, all kind of interaction really helps my channel, so thank you for the support. And I'll see you next week with a roundup of what happened in 2003. I hope you'll join me then.